Hello, everyone. Today we're going to continue with our story, Harry Potter in the Chamber of Secrets. When we left off yesterday in our story, Harry is at Diagon Alley with Hermione and Ron, and they're in the bookshop, and he has just met Gilderoy Lockhart, okay? So we are picking up with Gilderoy Lockhart. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, loudly waving for quiet, "what an extraordinary moment this is. The perfect moment for me to make a little announcement I've been sitting on for some time. When young Harry here stepped into Flourish and Blots today, he wanted to buy my autobiography, which I shall be happy to present him now free of charge." The crowd applauded again. "And he had no idea," Lockhart continued, giving Harry a little shake that made his glasses slip to the end of his nose, "that he would shortly be getting much, much more than my book, Magical Me. He and his schoolfellows will, in fact, be getting the real Magical Me. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have the great pleasure and pride in announcing that this September I will be taking up the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." The crowd cheered and clapped, and Harry found himself being presented with the entire works of Gilderoy Lockhart. Staggering slightly under their weight, he managed to make his way out of the limelight to the edge of the room where Ginny was standing next to her new cauldron. "You have these," Harry mumbled to her, tipping the books into the cauldron. "I'll buy my own." "Bet you loved that, didn't you, Potter?" said a voice Harry had no trouble recognizing. He straightened up and found himself face to face with Draco Malfoy, who was wearing his usual sneer. "Famous Harry Potter," said Malfoy. "Can't even go into a bookshop without making the front page." "Leave him alone. He didn't want all that," said Ginny. It was the first time she had spoken in front of Harry. She was glaring at Malfoy. "Potter, you've got yourself a girlfriend," drawled Malfoy. Ginny went scarlet as Ron and Hermione found their way over, both clutching their stacks of Lockhart's books. "Oh, it's you," said Ron, looking at Malfoy as if he was something unpleasant on the sole of his shoe. "Bet you're surprised to see Harry here, eh?" "Not as surprised as I am to see you in a shop, Weasley," retorted Malfoy. "I suppose your parents will go hungry for a month to pay for that lot." Ron went red as Ginny. He dropped his books into the cauldron, too, and he started towards Malfoy, but Harry and Hermione grabbed his jacket. "Ron!" said Mr. Weasley, struggling over with Fred and George. "What are you doing? It's mad in here. Let's go outside." Well, Arthur Weasley." It was Mr. Malfoy. He stood with his hand on Draco's shoulder, sneering up in the same way. "Lucius," said Mr. Weasley, nodding coldly. "Busy time at the ministry, I hear," Mr. Malfoy said. "With all of those raids, I hope they're paying you for overtime." He reached into Ginny's cauldron and extracted from amidst the glossy Lockhart books, very old, battered copy of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration. "Obviously not," he said. "Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to the name wizard if they don't even pay you well for it?" Mr. Weasley went flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. "We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name wizard, Malfoy," he said. "Clearly," said Mr. Malfoy with pale eyes, straying to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching apprehensively. "The company you keep, Weasley, and I thought your family could not sink any lower." There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him backwards into a bookshelf. Dozens of heavy spell books came thundering down on their heads. There was a yell, "Get him, Dad!" from Fred or George. Mrs. Weasley was shrieking, "No, Arthur, no!" The crowd stampeded backwards, knocking over more shelves. "Gentlemen, please, please," cried the assistant louder than all. "Break it up here, gents, break it up." Hagrid was wading towards them through the sea of books. In an instant, he pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had cut his lip, and Mr. Malfoy had been hit in the eye by an encyclopedia of toadstools. He was still holding Ginny's old Transfiguration book. He thrust it at her, his eyes glittering with malice. "Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you." Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco, and he swept from the shop. "You should have ignored him, Arthur," said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet as he straightened his robes. "Rotten to the core, that whole family. Everyone knows that. No Malfoy's worth listening to. Bad blood, that's what it is. Come on now, let's get out of here." The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them from reading, but he barely came up to Hagrid's waist, and he seemed to think better of it. They hurried to the street, and the Grangers were shaking with fright, and Mrs. Weasley beside herself with fury. "A fine example of what to set to your children, brawling in public like that. What Gilderoy Lockhart must have thought." "He was pleased," said Fred. "Didn't you hear him when we were leaving? He was asking that bloke from the Daily Prophet if he'd be able to work the fight into his report. Said it was all publicity." But it was a subdued group who headed back to the fireside in the Leaky Cauldron, where Harry, the Weasleys, and their shopping would be traveling back to the Burrow using Floo powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street on the other side. Mr. Weasley started to ask them how the bus stop works, but stopped quickly at the look on Mrs. Weasley's face. Harry took his glasses and put them safely in his pocket before helping himself to the Floo powder. It definitely wasn't his favorite way to travel. Chapter 5. The Whomping Willow. The end of the summer holidays came too quickly for Harry's liking. He was looking forward to going back to Hogwarts, but this month at the Burrow had been the happiest of his life. It was difficult not to feel jealous of Ron when he thought of the Dursleys and the sort of welcome he could expect the next time he turned up in Privet Drive. On their last evening, Mrs. Weasley conjured up a scrumptious supper which included all of Harry's favorite things, ending with mouth-watering treacle pudding. Fred and George rounded off the evening by a display of filibuster fireworks. They filled the kitchen with red and blue stars that bounced from ceiling to wall for at least a half hour. Then it was time for the last mug of hot chocolate and to bed. It took a long while to get started next morning. They were all up at the cock-crow, but somehow they still seemed to have a great deal to do. Mrs. Weasley dashed about in a bad mood, looking for spare socks and quills. People kept colliding on the stairs, half-dressed with bits of toast in their hands. And Mr. Weasley nearly broke his neck, tripping over a stray of chicken as he crossed the yard carrying Ginny's trunk to the car. Harry couldn't see how 8 people, 6 large trunks, 2 owls, and a rat were going to fit in one small Ford Anglia. He had reckoned, of course, without the special features Mr. Weasley had added. "Not a word to Molly," he whispered to Harry, as he opened the boot and showed him how magically expanded, so the trunks fitted easily. At last they were all in the car. Mrs. Weasley glanced to the back seat, where Harry, Ron, Fred, George, and Percy were all sitting comfortably side by side. "Muggles do know more than we give them credit for, don't they?" She and Ginny got the front seat, which had been stretched so it resembled a park bench. "I mean, you would never know it was this roomy from the outside, would you?" Mr. Weasley started up the engine, and they trundled out of the yard, Harry turning back for one last look at the house. He barely had time to wonder when he would see it again, when they were back. George had forgotten his box of filibuster fireworks. 5 minutes after that, they skidded to a halt in the yard so that Fred could run to his broomstick. They had almost reached the motorway when Ginny shrieked that she left her diary. By the time she clambered back into the car, they were running very late and tempers were high. Mr. Weasley glanced at his watch and then at his wife. "Molly, dear." "No, Arthur. No one would see. I have this little button here, an invisibility booster I installed that gets us up in the air. Then we fly above the clouds and we'd be there in 10 minutes. No one would be any wiser." "I said no, Arthur. Not in broad daylight." They reached King's Cross at 11:15. Mr. Weasley dashed across the road to get trolleys for their trunks, and they all hurried into the station. Harry had caught the Hogwarts Express the previous year. The tricky bit was getting onto the platform 9 3/4, which wasn't visible to the Muggle eye. What you had to do was walk through the solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. It didn't hurt, but it had to be done carefully so none of the Muggles noticed you were vanishing. "Percy first," said Mrs. Weasley, looking nervously at the clock overhead, which showed that they only had 5 minutes to disappear casually through the barrier. Percy strode briskly forward and vanished. Mr. Weasley went next. Fred and George followed. I'll take Ginny, and you two come right after us, Mrs. Weasley told Harry and Ron, grabbing Ginny's hand and setting off. In the blink of an eye, they were gone. Let's go together. We've only got a minute, Ron said to Harry. Harry made sure that Hedwig's case was safely wedged to the top of his trunk and wheeled his trolley about to face the barrier. He felt perfectly confident. This wasn't nearly as uncomfortable as using Floo powder. Both of them bent low over the handles of their trolley and walked purposely towards the barrier, gathering speed. A few feet away from it, they broke into a run. And crash! Both trolleys hit the barrier and bounced backwards. Ron's trunk fell off with a loud thump. Harry was knocked off his feet, and Hedwig's cage bounced onto the shiny floor as she rolled away, shrieking indignantly. People all around them stared as the guard nearby yelled, "What in blazes do you think you're doing?" Lost control of the trolley, Harry gasped, clutching his ribs as he got up. Ron ran to pick up Hedwig, who was causing such a scene that there was a lot of muttering about cruelty animals from the surrounding crowd. "Why can't we get through?" Harry hissed to Ron. "I don't know." Ron looked wildly around. A dozen other people were still watching them. "We're going to miss the train," Ron whispered. "I don't understand why the gateway sealed itself." Harry looked up at the gigantic clock with a sickening feeling in the pits of his stomach. 10 seconds. 9 seconds. He wheeled his trolley forward cautiously until it was right against the barrier, pushed it with all his might. The metal remained solid. 3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1. "It's gone," said Ron, sounding stunned. The train's left. What if Mom and Dad can't get through to us? Have you got any muggle money?" Harry gave a hollow laugh. "The Dursleys haven't given me pocket money for about 6 years. Ron pressed his ear to the cold barrier. "I can't hear a thing," he said tensely. "What are we going to do? I don't know how long it'll take Mom and Dad to get back to us." They looked around. People were still watching them, mainly because of Hedwig's continuing screeches. "I think we better go wait by the car," said Harry. "We're attracting too much attention." "Harry," said Ron, his eyes gleaming. "The car!" "What about it?" "We can fly the car to Hogwarts." "But I thought, we're stuck, right? And we've got to get to school, haven't we? And even underage wizards are allowed to use magic if it's a real emergency, Section 19 or something of the restriction thingy." Harry's feeling of panic suddenly turned to excitement. "Can you fly it?" "No problem," said Ron, wheeling his trolley to face the exit. "Come on, let's go. If we hurry, we'll be able to follow the Hogwarts Express." And they marched off through the crowd of curious muggles, out of the station, and back to the side road where the old Ford Anglia was parked. Ron unlocked the cavernous boot with his series of taps from his wand. They heaved their trucks back in, put Hedwig on the back seat, and got into the front. "Check, no one's watching," said Ron, starting the ignition with another tap of his wand. Harry stuck his head out the window. Traffic was rumbling in the main road ahead, but their street was empty. "Okay," he said. Ron pressed a tiny silver button on the dashboard, and the car around them vanished, and so did they. Harry could feel the seat vibrating beneath them. He could hear the engine and feel his hands on his knees and his glasses on his nose, but for all he could see, he'd become a pair of eyeballs floating a few feet above the ground and the dingy street full of parked cars. "Let's go," said Ron's voice from his right. The ground and the dirty buildings on either side fell away, dropping out of sight as the car rose. In seconds, the whole of London lay smoky and glittery below them. Then there were popping noise in the car, and Harry and Ron appeared. "Uh-oh," said Ron, jabbing the invisibility booster. "It's faulty." Both of them plummeted. The car vanished, then flickered back again. "Hold on," said Ron. "Hold on," Ron yelled and slammed his foot on the accelerator, and they shot straight of the low, woolly clouds, and everything turned dull and foggy. "What now?" Harry said, blinking at the solid mass of cloud pressing against them from all sides. "I think we need to see the train to know what direction to go in," said Ron. "Dip back down again, quickly." They dropped back beneath the clouds, twisting around in their seats and squinting to the ground. "I can see it," Harry yelled. "Right ahead, there." The Hogwarts Express was streaking below them like a scarlet snake. "Due north," said Ron, checking on the compass dashboard. "Okay, we'll just have to check every half hour or so. Hold on." And they shot up through the clouds. A minute later, they bursted out into a blaze of sunlight. It was a different world. The wheels of the car skimmed the sea of fluffy clouds and a sky of bright, endless blue under a blinding white sun. All we've got to worry about now are airplanes, said Ron. They looked at each other and started to laugh. For a long time, they couldn't stop. It was as though they had been plunged into a fabulous dream. This, thought Harry, was surely the only way to travel. Past swirls and turrets of snowy cloud and a car full of hot, bright sunlight, with a fat pack of toffees in the glove compartment, and the prospect of seeing Fred and George's jealous face when they landed smoothly and spectacularly on the sweeping lawn in front of the Hogwarts castle. They made regular checks on the train as they flew further and further north, each dipping beneath the clouds, showing them a different view. London was soon behind them, replaced by neat green fields which gave way into a wide turn, purplish moors, villages and tiny toy churches, and a great city alive with cars like multicolored ants. Several uneventful hours later, however, Harry had to admit that some of the fun was wearing off. The toffees had made them extremely thirsty, and they had nothing to drink. He and Ron pulled off their jumpers, but Harry's t-shirt was sticking to the back of his seat, and his glasses kept sliding down to the end of his sweaty nose. He had stopped noticing the fantastic cloud shapes now, and was thinking longingly of the train miles below, where you could buy ice-cold pumpkin juice from the trolley pushed by a plump witch. Why hadn't they been able to get on to platform 9 3/4? Can't be much farther, can it? Croaked Ron, hours later, still as the sun started to sink into their floor of clouds, staining it with deep pink. Ready for another check on the train? It was still right below them, winding its way past snow-capped mountains. It was much darker beneath the canopy of clouds. Ron put his foot on the accelerator and drove upwards again, but as he did so, the engine began to whine. Harry and Ron exchanged nervous glances. It's probably just tired, said Ron. It's never been this far before. They both pretended not to notice the whining growing louder and louder as the sky became steadily darker, blossoming into blackness. Harry pulled his jumper back on, trying to ignore the way the windscreen wipers were now waving feebly as in protest. Not far, said Ron, more to the car than to Harry. Not far now. He patted the dashboard nervously. When they flew back beneath the clouds, a little while later, they had to squint through the darkness for a landmark they knew. There, Harry shouted, making Ron and Hedwig jump straight ahead. Silhouetted on the dark horizon high over the cliff in the lake stood the many turrets of towers of the Hogwarts castle. But the car had begun to shudder and was losing speed. Come on, Ron said, giving the steering wheel a little shake. Nearly there, come on. The engine groaned. Narrow jets of steam were issuing from under the bonnet. Harry found himself gripping the edges of his seat as they very hard flew towards the lake. The car gave a nasty wobble. Glancing out at the back window of his window, Harry saw the smooth, black, glassy surface of the water a mile below. Ron's knuckles were right again on the steering wheel. The car wobbled again. Come on, Ron muttered. They were over the lake. The castle was right ahead. Ron put his foot down, and there was a loud clunk, a splutter, and the engine died completely. Uh-oh, said Ron into the silence. The nose of the car dropped. They were falling, gathering speed, heading straight toward the solid castle wall. No! Ron yelled, swinging the steering wheel around. They missed the stone wall by inches, and the car turned into a great arc, soaring past the greenhouses and vegetable patch, and then over the black lawns, losing height all this time. Ron let go of the steering wheel completely and pulled his wand out of his back pocket. Stop, stop, he yelled, whacking the dashboard with the windscreen, but they were still plummeting towards the ground, flying up towards them. Mind that tree, Harry bellowed, lunging for the steering wheel, but it was too late. Crunch. With an ear-splitting bang of metal on wood, they hit the thick tree trunk and dropped to the ground with a heavy jolt. Steam was billowing from underneath the crumpled bonnet. Hedwig was shrieking in terror. A golf ball-sized lump was throbbing on Harry's head where he had hit the windscreen to his right. Ron let out a low, despairing groan. Are you okay? Harry said urgently. My wand, said Ron in a shaky voice. Look at my wand. It snapped almost in two. The tip was dangling limply, held by a few splinters. Harry opened his mouth to say he was sure they'd be able to mend it up at school, but he had never even got started. At that very moment, something hit the side of the car with the force of a charging bull, sending them lurching sideways. Ron was equally heavy blow into Ron, just as an equally heavy blow hit the roof. What happened? That, boys and girls, is where we will stop today. So, where do you think that Harry and Ron have ended up? And how do you think it's going to go over with them driving the car to school? All right, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to talking with you all soon. Bye-bye.